Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, I'm talking about what I consider the best albums of the 70s by year. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. The 70s weren't just a decade. It was a decade that I think really forever changed music, and in a lot of ways changed culture along with it. And compared to the music that came before it, the music of the 70s, in a lot of ways, was almost like a revolution of sound. From the 60s hippie culture to the raw power of hard rock, the birth of punk, the rise of both funk and soul, and even the explosion and popularity of the concept album, the 70s pretty much had it all. And in many ways, I think the music of the 70s helped define what it meant to push the boundaries of music. So today I'm diving into what I think are the best albums of each year of the 70s. And these are albums that didn't just top the charts and produce massive hits. These are all albums that helped rewrite the rules of music. And like I always say when I do these kind of lists is, music is probably the most subjective form of art we have. It's one of those things that, musical taste and musical interest is as unique as your fingerprint. Nobody's is going to be the same as yours. That's why I think it's really interesting to take a look at a list like this, go through the decade by year, look at some really great albums that came out. But make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think are the best albums of the 70s by year. So 1970 was kind of a hard year for me. There's a bunch of great ones that came out that year. You've got Let It Be by the Beatles, Morrison Hotel by the Doors, John Lennon Plastic Ono Band came out that year, All Things Must Pass by George Harrison, Benefit by Jethro Tull. But the more I thought about it, there was only one album that I could pick that really, I think, defined 1970, and that is Paranoid by Black Sabbath. It was the band's second album from 1970, and a lot of people look at Paranoid as the first or one of the first true heavy metal albums. And it's an album I think would go on to define that genre in the 70s. The interesting thing about this album is originally it wasn't called Paranoid. The original title of this album was War Pigs, hence the album artwork. And when I was a kid, I never understood the connection of the album artwork to the title of the album. It's not their most experimental album, but it's an album I've loved since the first time I listened to it. I actually had my dad's records when I was a kid, and I would go through, and I always found this album. If I was looking for something to listen to, didn't really know, I'd always pull out Paranoid. And this is the album that really made me fall in love with Black Sabbath. So for 1971, it was a clear choice for me, even though there were a bunch of other great ones that came out that year. Metal from Pink Floyd came out in 71. Aqualung by Jethro Tull. Led Zeppelin 4, Imagine by John Lennon. Joni Mitchell's Blue came out in 71 also. And I'm not a big fan of The Who, but Who's Next came out that year also, which is a really great album. But above all those, like I said, it was a clear choice for me. It's always going to be What's Going On by Marvin Gaye. I've long considered this album the second greatest album ever recorded, behind an album that shows up a little later in my list here. But as far as this album goes, this album really marked a creative turning point, not only for Marvin Gaye, but for Motown as a whole also. It's one of the most socially conscious albums of the 70s, and a lot of the stuff that Marvin Gaye touches on in this album is still relevant today. 72 was another difficult year for me. There's a lot of great albums that came out that year. You had Black Sabbath 4 came out. You had The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, Talking Book by Stevie Wonder. You had Tonky Chateau by Elton John came out that year also. And this one ended up being kind of a tough choice for me. I decided to go with Harvest by Neil Young. This would go on to be his most commercially successful album here in the U.S. It sold over 4 million copies. It's also Neil's only album to hit number one on the Billboard 200. It blends rock, folk, and country, and I think Harvest is one of those albums that really helped define the early part of the decade. The interesting thing about this album is I was still listening to records until the late part of the 90s. I want to say it was like 97 or 98 when I bought my first CD. Harvest was the first one I bought. So even though there's a bunch of great albums I could have picked for 73, you had Goat's Head Soup by Rolling Stones come out that year. You had Aladdin Sane by David Bowie. Billion Dollar Babies by Alice Cooper. You had Goodbye Yellow Brick Road by Elton John came out that year. This is another year where it was a pretty easy choice for me. It was always going to be The Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. This is the album, like I said earlier in the episode, Marvin Gaye's What's Going On is the second best album ever made, behind only The Dark Side of the Moon. It will go on to sell over 45 million copies worldwide. It would spend a record 741 consecutive weeks on the Billboard 200. And overall, non-consecutive weeks, it would spend almost 1,000 weeks on that chart. I think one of the things that makes this album so special is the groundbreaking production work on here by Alan Parsons, and he would help the band push the boundaries of music and help this album become one of the most iconic of the decade. One of the things I've always found interesting about this album is a lot of people label this as a concept album, and I guess I could see some of that, but it's a very loose concept, and this is also ranks pretty high on if you ever look up, the best progressive rock albums of the decade. This album always ends up on there, but I don't see how people consider this a progressive rock album either. It's more of an art rock album than anything. So I don't think 74 was a great year for music. I mean, yes, you had Diamond Dogs by David Bowie. Was it 461 Ocean Boulevard by Eric Clapton came out that year. Natty Dread by Bob Marley. Kiss's debut album came out that year. Queen 2 also. But I decided to go with an album that I've long considered one of the best debut albums of the 70s, and that is the debut album from Bad Company. A lot of people out there might not know that Bad Company was actually considered a supergroup. They were formed by members of Free, Mott the Hoople, and King Crimson. And even though the band would release really good albums after this one, I don't think they could ever match what they did on this first album. I think their debut album really kind of helped set the standard for arena rock in the 70s. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that there was so much crossover appeal with this album. And this was another one of my dad's albums that I would spin pretty regularly when I was growing up. So 75 was kind of a fascinating year for music because it seemed like almost every single week another iconic album came out that year. You've got Toys in the Attic by Aerosmith came out, Sabotage by Black Sabbath, Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd, Born to Run by Bruce Springsteen came out, Night at the Opera by Queen, One of These Nights by the Eagles, Fleetwood Mac's self-titled album came out that year also, which is the first album with Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham. But the album I decided to go with is one that it took me a really long time to come around this album, and I don't really know why. It was just one of those albums where I loved the earlier albums from this band, so I think I just kind of dominated my listening experience from them. And then it's probably within the last, I'd say, 15 years, I really found an appreciation for this album. That is Physical Graffiti by Led Zeppelin. Something I didn't know about this album for the longest time is when they actually went to go record this in 74, when they finished a recording session, they only had enough music to fill 3 sides of a double album. So instead of coming up with more music, what they ended up doing was going back and they added 7 previously unreleased songs on here, which were recorded between, I think it was 71 and 73, those songs were recorded. This is another one of those instances where this is probably not their best album, but I think this is the band at their creative peak. It would go on to sell over 8 million copies in the US, and I think the album artwork is as iconic as the album. 76 is another one of those years I could have easily picked another 3 or 4 albums. I had it narrowed down to probably my top 5 for this year. But Hotel California came out that year, Songs of the Key of Light by Stevie Wonder, Boston's self-titled album. I'm not the biggest Kiss fan, but Destroyer came out that year, which is easily my favorite Kiss album. I decided to go with an album that a lot of people look at as the birth of punk, and that is a self-titled debut album from the Ramones. And initially, this was not a commercially successful album, but over time, it would become this big iconic album and probably one of the most influential albums of all time. I think similar to Physical Graffiti by Led Zeppelin, this is not the best album. It is a great album, but I think the band would do better things in their career. But this is an album that would lay the foundation for not only what the Ramones would do across their career, but what punk music would be for the next 20 years. But this is another one of those albums that took me a really long time to finally sit down and listen to. I grew up with their greatest hits on cassette. I always listened to Rocket to Russia, was probably my favorite album from the band. I love Pleasant Dreams, but it wasn't, I don't think, until they released, there was an expanded CD release that they did, I think it was 2001 or 2002. That was the first time I really sat down and listened to this album and was blown away by it. And I understood why this album has had the influence that it's had for 50 years. I think the interesting thing about the 70s is as the decade went on, I think the overall quality of music did diminish some, and I don't know if it's because of disco and kind of watering down music, but by the time you got to 77, there wasn't this huge number of great albums I had to dig through. There's only a small handful that I considered. I mean, you got Marquee Moon by Television, Rumors by Fleetwood Mac, Rocket to Russia by the Ramones, you've got News of the World by Queen, Exodus by Bob Marley. Those were really kind of it. At least in my opinion, those were like the core great albums for that year. And then the one I decided to go with is Animals by Pink Floyd. So this is the album where Roger Waters really took creative control of the band. And this is a dark album. It's definitely darker than anything they'd done before. And I've long looked at Animals as kind of the last true Pink Floyd album because this was the album that broke the band. It would be after they released this album that they would fire Richard Wright. Yes, he was involved with recording on The Wall, but he wasn't a true part of the band then. And if you listen to this album and compare it to albums they released earlier in their career, you can definitely hear a completely different tone on this album than anything that Pink Floyd did before. And a lot of people, including myself, hold up Dark Side of the Moon as the pinnacle of their career, but I think Animals is just a notch behind it. So by the time 78 rolled around, music was in a big transition, especially rock music, from what it was earlier in the decade to what would become in the 80s. And there were some albums that really helped that transition. Albums like Darkness at the Edge of Town by Bruce Springsteen. The Carousel title album came out that year. You even had albums like One Nation Under Groove by Funkadelic that would help move that needle in rock music. But I think there's one album that is the pinnacle of that transitional period, and that's the debut album from Van Halen. And say what you will about Eddie Van Halen, but this is an album where it really showcased his revolutionary playing style. As far as rock albums go in the late 70s and early 80s, their debut album is probably the most influential out of all of them, and it brought an entirely different energy to rock music. Now, I know Van Halen would go on to have even more popular albums after this one, but over my lifetime, this is probably my most listened to album from the band. And it's got many of my favorite songs from the band on it. So that brings us down to the end of the decade with 1979, and there's some hugely iconic albums that came out that year. I mean, you had Highway to Hell by AC/DC, you had Breakfast in America by Supertramp, you had Damn the Torpedoes by Tom Petty, London Calling by The Clash, but I decided to go with an album that I've long considered probably the best double album ever recorded, and that is Pink Floyd's The Wall. Not only do I think this is one of the best double albums of all time, I think it's probably the best concept album of all time also. When you sit down and listen to The Wall, it's not just an album, it's an entire musical experience. When Roger Waters crafted this album, he poured his trauma, his grief, his anger all into this album. For the longest time, I was somebody that said, look, you can take The Wall and trim off probably a third of the songs on here, and it might make an even better album. But I think the older I've gotten, the more I've sat down and listened to this album from beginning to end, I think if you took those songs out, you'd lose a lot of the meaning of the album. Because it's a lot of those smaller, intricate songs that connect big ideas on the album. And this is an album that would take the band a very long time to recover from. Yes, they would release the final cut a few years later, which basically was a Roger Waters solo album. After he would leave the band, they would release A Momentary Lapse of Reason, which was pretty much just a David Gilmour solo album. It wasn't until they released The Division Bell where the band finally got back to being that creative force. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think are the best albums of the 70s by year. Because like I said, going through this list, I had, probably 6 or 7 albums I could have picked easily for almost every year of the decade. It was tough. Some of those years, it was really kind of splitting hairs to come down and pick just one album. But let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.